This lecture follows upon many such as New Historicism, with many of the same interests in popular culture with cultural studies that seeks to investigate how, not only looking at high art as we would understand it, or high-brow literature, can help us understand what happens with the dominant ideology in a culture, but also looking to low and middle-brow examples and how they can equally be informative of what people believed in a given group at a specific time. Now, with New Historicism, we sought to juxtapose canonical works with anecdotal ones, such as attempting to understand Shakespeare with the description of someone's dream at the same time. So this is going to be reading literature and history as co-texts instead of just contexts. So what that means is we're looking at examples which can include popular culture, but generally to help elucidate and understand the canon or something to be considered high art. Examples cited would include understanding abstract expressionism only with the notion of World War II as a backdrop, and popular cultural productions, advertisings, and pinup girls to elucidate what it actually meant and how we can interpret it better. The backdrop or co-text, if you were. Turning now to Walter Benjamin and his work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility, printed anywhere between 1936 and 39 in a series of essays. We have a scholar in Germany who died fleeing the Nazis in 1940 and whose work was relatively obscured until it was republished in 1955. In it, this Marxist literary and aesthetic critic is going to argue that the uniqueness of works of art in the past, what he calls their aura, are going to be destroyed with the advent of capitalist mass production, which devalues the original because we can mass produce it and make many of them. The best example that Benjamin gives is going to be comparing painting, for instance, the classic example of high art, to film, which of course can be viewed multiple times by a mass audience and is reproduced as such. He argues that film abolishes authenticity and the aura of an artwork. He then states that it enjoins us to participate with the artwork and the audience simultaneously, to where we do not have this unique understanding of a work of art that cannot be reproduced, that is original. But he does not bemoan this passing of some period long past in a nostalgic fashion. Instead, he looks forward to the ability of democratizing art and what that means for us looking at culture and how we can actually, for cultural studies critics, get as much looking at movies that are popular in a particular era as paintings that were made. This is a revolutionary idea. So visual or cultural studies states that human subjects in cultural production are formed by cultural forces, which seems relatively straightforward and relatively obvious. But we need to think about what culture actually is. We use the term all the time, but we do not consider what we're talking about. Because culture technically is the aggregate of language, knowledge, belief, morality, law, customs, and art in any given era, accepted and appreciated by a particular group. Now, importantly, for cultural studies critics, this is not only taken from the elite canon or those produced for an elite audience, which is what most of history focused on, only a select few for the richest members of society and produced for their sensibilities. But does that actually tell us about what people say in the 1930s actually cared about across America and Europe when the Great Depression was ravishing the economy? Therefore, we must also look at low or middle brow culture as we would understand it if we are to truly understand what people felt or believed in any given time. So visual culture is actually a neo-Marxist strategy and approach, meaning it considers economic factors and socio-historical factors, and argues that images especially are part of a complex sign system representing the classes. We identify with certain visual signs that we are attuned to and are accustomed to seeing. Therefore, we find that works of art here, arguably, are not the serious active agent in shaping culture. They are not a passive reflection, but an important way to understand it. Therefore, aesthetics in any given period are highly determined and cultural. So the history of culture, visual or otherwise, is not bound up by masterpieces as we would understand them, or great art. And this can be understood in all various cultural productions: music, opera, art, film. Not only the highbrow examples are going to be meaningful, we can look at a wider range and consider other aspects of visual culture, such as decorative arts, posters, movies, music videos, etc. For the cultural critics, they are going to study, in fact, mass or popular culture with everyday materials in order to understand the context of their ideologies or the dominant ideas and values of that time that created them. So cultural studies, as defined by Stuart Hall, is going to state that people simultaneously make and consume culture. We are not passive bystanders. It's a continuous process of encoding meaning and decoding meaning at the audience level. Therefore, institutions, whether they be Hollywood, the government, or otherwise, encode ideas in mass media, and then the audiences decode it. One of the best examples of how this is a two-way street would be things like fan fiction, or how we're going to take something that is popular and remake it, to decode it in our own way and disseminate it for popular consumption again. Now, cultural studies includes a wide range of subject matter, including television, cinema, advertising, rock music, magazines, minority literatures, and popular literatures, including thrillers, science fiction, romances, westerns, and Gothic novels. And importantly, especially in the literary side, it looks at how these materials are produced, distributed, and consumed. So the example often given are romance novels, which are generally not considered by serious, high-minded literary critics. But if we are to look at how they are structured, the tropes that are used, who publishes them, where they are sold, you will find an interlocking and interconnected network that reinforces certain ideologies, such as the cultural pressure to fall in love and get married. So ideology, importantly here, with cultural studies, will examine these ideas, feelings, beliefs, values, and representations that are embedded in these artifacts and the practices of a particular culture or group. So what are they actually communicating with TV shows, with movies, with, again, rock posters, with, once again, rap lyrics? All of these are considered by cultural studies critics. Now, literary critics, on the other hand, oppose cultural studies, and they criticize it for displacing the canon by popular culture, by showing or lifting up something that should not be revered in place of something else that should, like Shakespeare, for instance, the most popular example. And they also criticize cultural studies for politicizing the discipline, claiming that their approach and selection of the canon is apolitical and should remain as such, when many of the other methodologies and theories we've been discussing state that nothing should be taken for granted and everything is politicized. So cultural studies critics, on the other hand, argue that literature changes from time, place, and group, and what that is considered as. If we go back and look at classical Greek epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, we need to remember that they originally came from the oral tradition and were sung. They were not written down and meant to be read as we do now. Now, one of the most important things to remember about cultural studies is that literature, or we should say culture in general, is going to be symptomatic of the state of its society. What they produce is going to relate their ideology. What did they care about? What do they believe? And no matter how insignificant we might think it, whether that be a pop song or a B movie, it still is going to communicate something about what is important to us. Now, there are a wide array of discourses that can be considered in cultural studies that in the literary side would include rap lyrics, blues poems, oral legends, diaries, magazines, movies, posters, romances, soap operas, and even video game narratives, very important. Now, the three different investigative or processes by which cultural studies critics will use and consider will be the operations of the unconscious, what is going to be operating behind the scenes when we're looking at something, socio-historical forces, such as what economic class are we going to be advertising to, or is this consumed by, and the multiple subject positions we each occupy. Are we being marketed to or entertained as a husband, a son, a wife, a mother, a friend? All of these things we can occupy simultaneously. And we should note that this is obviously diametrically opposed to formalism, as formalism only is concerned with what is the formal characteristics in anything, that being musically, as far as literature, as far as imagery, does not consider anything beyond that, like socio-historical contexts. So in the 21st century, we find this has fragmented quite recently into several niches or subfields that are as diverse as body studies, environmental studies, globalization studies. Media studies are very popular, as are popular cultural studies we find in many universities. Subculture studies are also quite popular, all the way down to working class studies, especially given the political climate of the last election. These are very popular now. So what do cultural studies critics do? Well, they reject formalism, that being something that does not question socioeconomic contexts, and focus on the elite or high art as the only way to understand culture. This is rejected outright because we know, just by considering the fact, that low and middle-brow cultural productions are as significant, if not more so, in indicating a broader ideology in any culture or civilization. And third, we find that cultural studies critics will investigate how mass media and popular culture elucidates or helps explain to us the ideology of the culture that created them, whether that be a dime romance novel from the 1950s or a pop culture icon or a poster of them, or a rock album cover. All of these are as significant as high art or as Mozart or Shakespeare.